Okay, let's unpack this. We are diving into what is arguably the most persistently vexing philosophical cage match in modern interactive media. Ludo-Narrative Dissonance. L&D for short.
Right. It's the academic term for the age-old problem of why my extremely murderous sort of sociopathic video game avatar sometimes cries about a flower in a cutscene.
That's the way to put it.
It's the conflict between the ludic, so the mechanics, the rules, what you as the player do, and the narrative, the story, the plot, what the character says they are.
Exactly. And this concept, it really gained an intellectual traction almost immediately after the game designer Clint Hawking coined it back in 2007.
Yeah.
He was specifically critiquing BioShock. He put name to that, that pervasive nagging feeling that something structural was just
Right.
wrong. He called it a certain sensation of detachment.
And right there, that definition, detachment, broken immersion, that's the academic premise we have to challenge immediately. The traditional purist stance sees L&D as an inherent problem, maybe a design flaw that needs to be avoided. For the purist, the only goal is harmony, right?
Correct.
The idea that every click, every single kill, every resource decision has to flawlessly synchronize with the written script.
And why wouldn't it? I mean, if a medium, especially one as expensive and influential as modern gaming, is striving to be meaningful, or what some might call high art, then this structural integrity is absolutely paramount.
Yeah, no.
Dissonance means the work is internally contradictory. It has, in a way, failed in its duty to communicate a single, coherent vision from the designer to the player. It's a broken system.
See, I fundamentally disagree that it's a failure. And here is the immediate clash, the industry reality that these high-minded theories consistently ignore.
Oh,
You cite BioShock, which was a critical and commercial darling. Other games repeatedly cited for egregious L&D, like Uncharted or the Grand Theft Auto franchise.
Yeah.
They're market juggernauts. They define the success of the medium. So if the core argument is that dissonance breaks immersion and creates fatal detachment, then why were these supposedly broken games so critically and commercially lauded?
Commercial success is not the metric for artistic integrity. We're talking about philosophical coherence here.
But we are talking about the player experience. Focusing on L&D only as a flaw completely ignores the commercial reality that players clearly accept it, they internalize it, and they even enjoy a degree of narrative bending if the underlying mechanics, the Ludos, are robustly and fundamentally fun.
Fun.
Players compartmentalize. It's that simple.
That is the crucial tension. And that's our mission for this deep dive, to determine whether Ludo-Narrative Dissonance is merely a structural betrayal, a sign of sloppy design compromises forced by budget or market pressures, or if it is a powerful, perhaps even intentional, aesthetic resource that actually invites you, the player, to step back, to analyze the conflict, and take a conscious, meta-ethical standpoint on the action you're performing.
That's a big or.
Let's establish the purist argument firmly then. Rooted in, high theory concepts of art and literature, the core problem of L&D stems from contradictory directives.
Right.
It's the opposition between what the player is mechanically rewarded for, the ludic incentives, and what the story mandates the character should do, the narrative directives.
The game, in essence, is schizophrenic. It whispers one thing in your ear, the story, and then slaps cash down on the table for the opposite action, which is the gameplay loop.
A perfect analogy. And the clearest and most famous example remains BioShock. The world of Rapture is a critique of fierce, individualistic, Randian objectivism.
Right, where the highest moral purpose is rational self-interest.
Precisely. And the game system is designed to place the player, Jack, directly into this moral framework. You find the Little Sisters who are harvesting Adam, this powerful genetic currency. You have a choice.
Rescue them for a small, delayed, sort of ethical reward, or harvest them for a massive, immediate power boost.
And the ludic incentive is undeniable. Harvesting provides the resources you need right now to survive Rapture's punishing difficulty curve.
Yeah, the system clearly rewards the ruthless Randian approach. I mean, if you're playing optimally, you're harvesting. No question.
Exactly. Yet the narrative, driven by the character Atlas, is constantly directing the player towards selflessness and altruism. Atlas represents the emotional, non-Randian perspective.
So no matter what you choose.
The player, regardless of their choices, is following a narrative thread that explicitly critiques the philosophy the game mechanics are built upon. The purist view is that this dissonance fundamentally undermines the developer's intended critical message.
How so?
Why should the player care about the moral statement against self-interest when the game's core reward loop encourages, even demands the opposite behavior just to succeed? The story's moral force is, well, it's neutered by the gameplay loop.
That assumes the player must engage with the critical message to enjoy the game. For many, I'd argue, the critical message is just window dressing for a superb shooter experience.
But that's a different debate.
Okay, fine. But let's consider the design goal if L&D is truly the enemy. What is the harmonious game supposed to look like?
Well, scholars analyzing this dilemma have identified that developers striving to avoid L&D often fall into one of two unsatisfactory traps. The first is what we call too much story.
Right, these become heavily linear games. Think the early Final Fantasy titles, or even Zelda, Ocarina of Time.
Yes, and they sacrifice player agency to preserve a single, fixed narrative truth. They become, as some critics describe it, a quasi-book that we read by playing.
Which is deeply unsatisfying for an interactive medium, isn't it? The moment the player feels like they are just waiting for the next cutscene, the power of the game is just diminished.
Precisely. The second trap is too much life. This means relying entirely on emergent narratives, those unstructured, endlessly evolving possibilities generated purely by simulation, like the very early text adventures.
A noble goal, but
But this pursuit of pure simulation risks mechanical repetition and a lack of narrative structure. And this lack of polish or obvious scripting causes something called immersion.
immersion, okay, that's a critical concept here, and we need to define it clearly for everyone listening because it's distinct from L&D.
Please do.
L&D is the conflict between story and rules. Immersion is the breaking of immersion because the rules themselves become too visible or, obviously manipulated.
Correct. When you realize the NPC guard you just knocked out always respawns in the exact same spot 10 seconds later, or when an event is too obviously scripted or repeated, you stop seeing a living world and start seeing the machine code.
Right, the curtain is pulled back.
The boundary between the simulated world and the system that runs it collapses, and you are pulled out of the experience. The designer trying to avoid L&D by leaning too hard on mechanics risks immersion.
So the purest demand for coherence is rigid. Either the story is rigid and limits action, or the mechanics are too visible and break the illusion. The solution, for the purist, seems to be eliminating choice altogether to maintain the designer's vision.
The purest demand for coherence states that for a game to function as a meaningful work, the designers must retain narrative control. If the mechanics and the story don't align, the designer is forced to surrender the power that they have over the story to the player without providing a proper ethical structure for that agency. Dissonance is merely the symptom that the surrender was botched.
But let me push back on the structural critique by expanding on the developer's burden. I'd argue that L&D is often simply unavoidable, especially given the state of modern game development.
How so? Unavoidable.
We are now working under a modern paradigm of enclosing many different mechanics and narrative elements in a single game. Just think about the sheer volume of systems in a single open world.
Crafting, exploration.
3 different combat trees, base building, relationship meters, physics engines, all enclosed in a single game.
The ambition is enormous, I'll grant you, but the coherence suffers.
Exactly. The conflict between agency, the player's ability to maximize their fun by leveraging all those system rules, and the necessity of fixed plot points required for a sophisticated cinematic story is a necessary tension.
A necessary evil, maybe.
When you try to simulate an entire city with hundreds of emergent possibilities, like in GTA V, and simultaneously tell a tight, emotional, character-driven story about heist crews and personal ambition, friction is inevitable.
What?
You cannot simulate life and deliver a perfect narrative arc without some component of that friction showing through. It's just the cost of complexity.
A cost many purists would argue isn't worth paying.
Okay, let's shift the perspective away from the academic ideal and look at how players actually rationalize their experience, because this is where the theory often, frankly, loses the plot.
Right.
We rely on the genre convention defense. I argue that a significant portion of L&D is simply accepted and expected under genre logic.
You're referring to the quintessential example, Nathan Drake in Uncharted. He's supposed to be this charming, witty, morally centered hero in the tradition of Indiana Jones during cutscenes.
But in gameplay, he is a genocidal mercenary who leaves literal piles of bodies behind him.
Right. And you're saying that's not dissonance?
I'm saying the skeptic gamer argues that this adheres perfectly to the conventions of the action-adventure movie genre. Think Indiana Jones, or more recently, John Wick. The mass murder in that context is expected fantasy.
It's the language of the genre.
It's the kinetic language of the action game, not a serious moral critique. If Nate Drake killed only 2 people in the entire game, it would cease to be an action game and become a frustrating puzzle platformer. The ludic reality is that if the game is about shooting, the character has to shoot a lot. The story's explicit themes, whimsical treasure hunting, are not deeply betrayed by the gameplay's theme high-octane action.
That is a fair assessment of genre expectations, but I think it ignores the fundamental connection between player and avatar in an interactive medium.
How so?
If the player identifies with the avatar, if they treat the character as their own project in the making, imbuing it with their own values and trajectory, then that mass murder, however fun or genre appropriate, becomes a structural lie about the player's own projected moral agency. It's an egocentric experience where you are the one pulling the trigger and causing the destruction.
But that projection assumes the player is using the game as a rehearsal for real-world ethics, rather than as a disposable fantasy playground. That's projecting the philosopher's burden onto the average player, when most players are just there for the spectacle, the rocket sliding, and the challenge of the core mechanics.
Let's refine this conflict using the GTA 5e example, because it's far more subtle than Uncharted.
Okay.
Nico Bellic, the protagonist, has a clear, stated narrative goal.
Yeah.
He wants emancipation. He wants to escape his traumatic criminal past and find peace in America.
Right.
Yet the game's core reward loop, the open-world chaos mechanics, rewards the player for clinging tightly to crime and maximizing the forthright fascination and fun of the combat system.
So the player is financially and mechanically incentivized to pull him deeper into the violent life he claims to despise. The car chases, the shootouts, the ability to exploit the physics engine, that is the main dish. The story of Nico's emotional trauma is the side salad.
That subtle incongruity, as some scholars suggest, is where L&D becomes fascinating. It forces the player to ask, does my desire to maximize fun by utilizing these systems outweigh Nico's psychological state and narrative journey?
It's a direct conflict.
It places the player's personal ludic priority in direct moral conflict with the fixed narrative direction.
But the player's answer 99 times out of 100 is yes. The desire to maximize fun is the player's priority in that moment. They are leveraging the system's affordances because the mechanical systems are the primary reason the game exists.
And what about players' choice over narrative consistency?
Well, we talk about that, but that choice is often illusory. Look at modern interactive fiction, even something like the Black Mirror, Bandersnatch movie. That freedom of choice is sometimes revealed to be a hoax, where only one path allows the story to move forward and the others just reset you to a checkpoint.
Which simply proves that the developer is still imposing their will. But even when the agency is limited or predetermined, sources note that audiences still choose to interact.
Why, though?
Because they feel they are actively participating and are not just passive observers. They are rehearsing their ethos via moral choices, even if the result is ultimately fixed. They are testing hypotheses about how the world reacts to their decisions. The moment of choosing is what matters, not the outcome.
And developers know this tension between a fixed plot and player freedom exists, so they rely heavily on management tools to try and mitigate the resulting dissonance. This brings us to what we call shouter figures.
Ah, yes, the shouter figures.
These are the characters or mechanisms that constantly cue the player on what to do, often leading to a kind of psychological conflict.
This is a crucial area of design compromise. We can discern three types of these figures based on the source material.
Okay, lay them out. First, the teacher. This figure tutors you in the mechanics. They tell you how to operate the game.
Right, think of the endless instruction pop-ups in an open-world RPG, or the AI companion in Watch Dogs 2 constantly telling you which button performs which hack. They guide the ludic journey.
Then there's the director. This figure steers the player toward the narrative goal, often with an abrasive, urgent tone. They dictate the narrative journey, making sure the player doesn't wander too far off the plot rails.
We see this in games like The Early Adventures Orc 2, or, most explicitly, the voice of Lionel Starkweather in Manhunt, who is constantly shouting at you to escalate the violence.
And third, the developer. This figure combines both roles, often with an ironical or metatextual twist, directly breaking the fourth wall.
The narrator in the Stanley Parable is the perfect example here. He's not just commenting on Stanley's actions, but on the player's choice to ignore his direction.
And this happens less explicitly in games like GTA 4, where the game world itself seems to comment on Nico's hypocrisy.
The very existence of these figures constantly buzzing with cues and instructions shows that the designers are actively trying to control the LND and keep the player focused on the prescribed narrative path.
But often, as the research notes, this control leads to a desecration of the synchronicity of the game and the story it derives from. An over-anxious director can inspire active resistance.
It can backfire.
It proves that the conflict is structural and the player is not passive. When the director in the Stanley Parable tells you to take the door on the left, the core enjoyment of the game becomes the player's choice to take the door on the right, actively defying the authorial instruction.
The player is intentionally creating dissonance against the shouter figure.
Yes, the modern paradigm demands constant shouting to keep the player focused, which in turn demonstrates that the design is fundamentally struggling against the player's desire for unregulated fun and freedom.
Okay, now we get to the most rigorous part of this debate. We must articulate the strongest possible version of our opponent's argument, even if we fundamentally disagree with it. We have to truly steelman their best case. I'll start by defending your perspective, the skeptic gamer's perspective, that L&D is actually a virtue of the medium.
I await your strong defense of chaos and incoherence.
Steelman 1. The Art of Discomfort. We concede that L&D, when executed intentionally and with precision, is not a flaw, but a source of inspiration for creation. It leads to a creative victory.
Okay.
The dissonance forces the player to halt their unreflective action and engage in a profound metaethical standpoint. This is directly analogous to the distancing effects championed by the German playwright Bertolt Brecht.
That's a crucial intellectual parallel. Brecht sought to purposely pull viewers out of the dramatic immersion, the emotional identification, to create an interactive and dialectical relationship with the performance.
He wanted the audience to think rather than just feel. And games achieve this uniquely because they provide egocentric experience that is of and about the self. The player is implicated in the action, unlike a theater goer. We see this in examples like Papers, Please. The game forces the player, acting as an immigration officer in a totalitarian state, to constantly contend with a brutal social double bind.
Walk us through that double bind. It's an excellent example of intentional dissonance.
The Ludic system requires you to strictly observe complex, constantly changing immigration rules to avoid heavy fines. If you make too many mistakes, your meager salary is docked, and you cannot provide heat, food, or medicine for your impoverished, suffering family.
So the pressure is immense.
The narrative, however, constantly throws moral dilemmas at you. A refugee whose documents are technically invalid but whose life is threatened, a desperate mother separated from her children, or a spouse trying to smuggle contraband.
So the system rewards bureaucratic rigidity, but the narrative demands human compassion.
That's the dissonance. You are sourced into agonizing moral compromise, shifting from unreflective and mechanistic rule-following, which is the default gaming state, to appreciating the expansive moral scope of your role. The game is forcing you to choose between your family's survival and a stranger's life. That discomfort, that moment of L&D, is the art.
And that concept is amplified in games like Undertale. If you choose the genocide run and kill many monsters, the narrative consequence isn't immediate.
Right.
Only later, when you return to a seemingly harmless town, do you find it deserted. The former inhabitants fled, fearing they would be the hostile intruder's next target.
That structural consequence is profound. It's about the player's social imprint. The game generates self-conscious moral emotions like guilt through first-person egocentric experience. That is intentional, powerful art enabled by the dissonance between how you usually play RPGs, level up by killing, and the narrative consequences of treating life as disposable experience points.
Okay, I will concede that those examples showcase the potential for L&D to be used artistically. But here is the purist refutation that must dismantle this steelman. I have to insist that this potential for art is not the default state of L&D. These intentional examples, Papers, Please, Undertale, Spec Ops, the line, they are celebrated precisely because they are rare.
You're saying most L&D is accidental?
Most L&D, as seen in BioShock or GTA, appears unintentional. It's a result of commercial constraints, time pressures, or just poor integration. The industry average is not Brechtian drama, it's just clumsy writing crashing into a massive physics engine.
I see the point.
And when L&D is accidental, it's often mitigated poorly by heavy scripting or intrusive director-shouter figures that interrupt the synchronicity. The artistic purity is often contaminated by the need for commercial viability and the fun metric.
So in your view,
90% of the L&D we observe is a failure of design, not a creative victory. Intentional L&D is the exception that proves the rule of general incompetence.
now it is your turn. Let's hear the strongest possible case for the skeptic gamer, the defense of fun and play above all else.
My pleasure. I will steelman the academic purist's view, focusing on the defense of the system, not the story. Steelman 2. The primacy of play. The critique that L&D is a moral or artistic failure is, to be blunt, irrelevant.
They're irrelevant.
Because L&D is simply the unavoidable cost of making a game work and be inherently enjoyable.
You argue that the ludic system must inherently come first.
Absolutely. The mechanics of structured combat, which is the primary source of L&D by necessitating mass murder, offer unparalleled depth. Rules, strategy, feedback loops, player improvement, and challenge.
And compared to other systems.
Compared to simple dialogue choices or exploration systems, combat provides the most robust form of continuous engagement. And trying to eliminate L&D would destroy that engagement.
How so?
Trying to enforce the rigid narrative consistency the purists demand by severely reducing combat, say, limiting Nathan Drake to only 1 or 2 kills per mission because he's a good guy, would fundamentally result in a worse game.
You'd gut the core engagement.
Completely. The reality is that commercial success overwhelmingly favors player freedom and fun, making the purely academic critique irrelevant to the marketplace. The industry is optimized for player freedom, even if it comes at the expense of absolute narrative consistency.
So the commercial imperative is the ultimate non-negotiable factor.
Yeah.
A game must prioritize being a game before it can be anything else, even high art.
Yes, that is the core defense. But now, here is my refinement and dismantling of my own strong argument.
Okay.
I must insist that the true benefit of these systems goes beyond mere fun maximization. Systems are necessary because they create a shared world with objective facts.
Explain that. What do you mean by objective facts in a fictional world?
Think about a tabletop or video RPG. How dangerous is a specific enemy like a frost giant? In a pure narrative, one dungeon master might rule it's impossible to defeat, another might decide it's trivial.
Both interpretations are equally viable, which leads to chaos.
Right. With a system, the objective facts of its health points, armor rating, and attack power are arbitrated and known to all. The system provides the universal language and the constraints.
I see.
So systems exist primarily to resolve conflict impartially, unify expectations, and structure the endeavor, ensuring that the group, the player, and the simulated world has a unified, consistent experience, regardless of the narrative flavor. L&D occurs when the fixed, rigid facts of the story, like Nico is tired of killing, conflict with the fixed, rigid facts of the system, like killing provides the most robust fun and resource loop. The conflict is structural, not moral.
We've established that L&D is mostly a flaw, but occasionally a resource. Now let's move to the highest form of the debate. Games where dissonance was not accidental or a byproduct of complexity, but explicitly intended by the designer to provoke a deep, painful, or necessary reaction.
Right.
We start with a case study in designed moral depravity.
Manhunt. Manhunt is the ultimate academic test case because its dissonance is the entire point. It doesn't ask you to accidentally be a bad person. It forces you to embrace being a monster.
The premise is brutal. James Earl Cash, a death row inmate, is forced by a snuff film director, Lionel Starkweather, to participate in a series of extremely violent executions for the director's entertainment.
And narratively, Cash has no reason or motivation to opt for greater brutality in the execution sequences. He's already doomed.
But the game is structured entirely around incentivizing the player to choose that greater brutality. The game rewards you with higher scores, better ranks, and more desirable fun for complex, gruesome, adrenaline-packed kills, the red kills over the green kills.
It's pure incentive.
The academic reading is that the game is an exercise in the player becoming a game designer themselves, attempting to establish resonance between what we call the L sentences and the N sentences. We should probably explain this jargon.
Please do. The L sentence is the ludic sentence, or the statement of action. I killed this person brutally.
And the N sentence is the narrative sentence, or the statement of justification. I kill this person brutally because...
Right. So in Manhunt, the player is essentially forced to create the narrative justification for the brutal action.
The L sentence, why do I kill so brutally, is answered by the N sentence, because Cash has to. He is coerced by the director, who is holding his family hostage, or whatever external narrative justification the game provides.
The player is establishing an alignment between the fictional character's coerced actions and the player's own agency.
And the director figure in Manhunt is constantly active, shouting at Cash, and by extension the player, to keep killing and not pause to reflect on the senselessness of his business.
The designer knows that player agency and moral reflection threaten the flow, so they use the director to demand unthinking action.
By revealing the emptiness of the violence cycle and forcing this internal rationalization, I am killing only because the director wants me to, not because I enjoy it. The academic view insists that Manhunt is an allegory of its own failure,
Its own fail.
an allegory of its own inability to escape the violence it is critiquing, and by extension, the player's inability to reject the ludic incentive of brutality. It's cynical art.
That's a powerful but profoundly depressing analysis. Let's compare this intentional moral trap to the most controversial recent attempt to force a moral experience. The Last of Us Part 2.
A very different beast.
This game didn't just want you to reflect. It wanted you to feel empathy for the character who just killed the beloved protagonist from the first game.
The plot is driven entirely by the villain, Abby, killing Joel. The authorial intent then forces the player to switch perspectives, taking control of Abby for a long, grueling section of the game.
Including traumatic flashbacks and resource-intensive combat, the explicit goal here was to create cognitive empathy toward the antagonist.
You have to walk in her shoes.
Understand her motive for revenge, see her side of the story, and experience her own suffering. Specifically, witnessing the bodies of her friends killed by Ellie. The designers spent hours trying to build a bond between the player and Abby.
They are essentially trying to retrofit the player's emotional attachment onto a new character. They're forcing the L sentence, "I am playing as Abby and want her to survive," to align with the N sentence, "Abby is a sympathetic character who deserves revenge."
But the critical point is the player reaction at the climax when the player, as Abby, is forced into a final, brutal confrontation with Ellie. Players, due to strong emotional attachment to Ellie, forged over the entire first game and the initial hours of the second, demonstrated intense dissent and physical refusals.
This is where we see the absolute primacy of deeply held player values over the designer's intent. Tell us more about that refusal, the self-sabotage.
We saw players actively rejecting the authorial intent to create a satisfying, coherent final conflict. Analysis of popular gameplay videos and forum discussions showed widespread engagement in self-sabotage.
Such as?
This included players intentionally throwing away key weapons, running out of ammunition so Abby would be defenseless, making noise to be discovered by Ellie, and even deliberately seeking game overs as Abby.
They were choosing to break the game's core mechanics, seeking death. Rather than harm the character they felt a profound narrative bond with.
Their emotional loyalty to the character was stronger than the cognitive empathy the game tried to impose. It was a flat-out refusal to perform the mandated ludic action.
So the skeptic gamer asks, if the player chooses to break the contract between player and author and deliberately refuses to play according to the rules, does the intended dissonance succeed or fail?
It's a great question. The game successfully pushed the player into a corner where they had to make a profoundly moral, agonizing choice, even if that choice was to self-sabotage the ludic structure and lose the game.
So it fails in its immediate objective to make the player rationalize Abby's actions and feel satisfactory closure. But it succeeds, in the purist view, by provoking an intense moral reflection and forcing the player's ethical beliefs to surface into conscious thought. That moment of refusal, that willingness to ruin one's own experience to maintain a personal moral consistency, demonstrates the unique power of L&D as an art form. It reveals that personal moral beliefs can trump the game's rules, even when those rules are essential for progression.
The irony is the game attempted harmony, but the failure to achieve that harmony produced the deepest, most interesting critical discussion.
So after this philosophical cage match, what is the ultimate takeaway on Ludo-Narrative Dissonance?
Well, we've established two core conflicting perspectives that remain fundamentally incompatible. My view, the skeptic gamer's view, remains that L&D is a necessary, often harmless, and largely accepted side effect of commercial priorities and player freedom.
The fun factor.
The mechanics of combat and player improvement are simply too enjoyable and robust to sacrifice for strict narrative consistency, and players use genre conventions to rationalize the dissonance away.
And the academic purist view, my view, is that while L&D is often a sign of design failure, when used intentionally, it transforms. It becomes a sophisticated tool for deep ethical inquiry, forcing consciousness raising, distancing the player from unreflective action, and promoting self-conscious moral reflection.
So the failures are the most interesting parts.
The games that fail the most spectacularly, BioShock by accident, The Last of Us Part 2 by design, often provoke the most important conversations.
I maintain that if a mechanic is fun, the player will simply rationalize the dissonance away. The desire for fun and the dominance of the ludic structure hold sway over the fragile narrative intent. The market validates this every time an Uncharted game sells tens of millions of copies.
And why is that?
Because the dissonance is compartmentalized as a necessary concession to enjoyment.
I, however, insist that the ethical reflection and the self-conscious moral emotions provoked by intentional dissonance must be the ultimate metric for a game's value, regardless of sales figures. The ultimate success of The Last of Us Part 2 wasn't that the player killed Ellie, but that the player was willing to break the game to avoid it, proving that the player's moral identity is more important than the designer's script.
Which is fantastic fodder for academic papers, but hardly a universal design philosophy.
Perhaps. But the evidence suggests that when faced with a true moral decision point, the player's own deeply held ethical beliefs can be stronger than the game's core rules and even the desire for mechanical fun. So if you, the listener, were forced to self-sabotage a game to remain morally consistent, what deep-seated personal value was the game forcing you to confront? And why was that value stronger than the rules of play? That is the real philosophical victory of ludonarrative dissonance.